Hello, I'm coming to you from Silverthorne this week for session 9 of our COVID-19 Colorado and Beyond webinar. As you know, it's sponsored by the University of Colorado Denver's College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and its continuing and professional education and interdisciplinary studies programs. I'm Marjorie Levine Clark, and I'm a professor of history and associate dean for diversity, outreach, and initiatives in the college, and I have been moderating the series. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask questions during the lecture, and we will have Q&A after the lecture. Try to get as many questions as we can. Information about student credit and continuing education units can be found on our continuing and professional education website. And students know by now that to get credit for the course, you have to write a one-page paper for every lecture. Today's prompt for your paper is: briefly describe an environmental policy change or other specific measure that could reduce the likelihood of emerging infectious diseases and potential global pandemics. Explain how the policy or measure would have the intended effect. And I'll read that again. Briefly describe an environmental policy change or other specific measure that could reduce the likelihood of emerging infectious diseases and potential global pandemics. Explain how the policy or measure would have the intended effect. And you know the prompt will also be posted on the course website along with all the other questions. The lecture is also being recorded and it will be up on our website and the CLES YouTube page. I want to thank the many people who made this webinar happen. First, Dean Pam Jansma and Assistant Dean Joanne Porter of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences for supporting this program and making credit available to many of our students at no cost. Our outstanding faculty who volunteered their time for this series: Mike Effler and Noah Dodero from the Office of Information Technology, Shana Bull, Amy Arnold, and the Office of Digital Education, Interim Associate Vice Chancellor of Academic Affairs, Joanne Brennan, the University Registrar, Carrie John, and her team, Associate Bursar, Eric Gray, and then from the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Tracy Combe, Director of Marketing and Communication, Laurel Dodds, Director of Continuing and Professional Education, Course and Curriculum Coordinator, Mary Lovett, and Kristen Salisbury, Program Manager for Continuing and Professional Education, who oversaw putting this whole event together. Today's lecturer is Peter Anthamatten, Associate Professor and Chair of Geography and Environmental Sciences. Professor Anthamatten received his PhD in Geography and a Master's in Public Health from the University of Minnesota. His primary area of research is the geography of health, and he will be speaking today on geographic perspectives on emerging infectious disease, global pandemics, and COVID-19. Welcome, Professor Anthamatten.
Hi, thank you very much for that introduction. And so, as Marjorie mentioned, before I get on, do you guys see my slides? I just want to make sure that I'm...
Yes.
Okay, we're good to go. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how a medical geographer would think about the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of the primary ways that I'm going to do that is by talking about other pandemics and some of the lessons that we've learned about them. Ultimately, to think about what kinds of policies writ large, sort of broader policies, we can think about undertaking to minimize the risk for future pandemics. Before I get started, I think one of the kind of nifty things about this lecture series is the fact that we're assembling so many people from different perspectives. And so you can see how we can approach this common problem of COVID-19 from very distinct approaches, asking different questions based on our disciplinary background. So I'll talk very briefly about what we do in geography. I think there's a lot of sort of generally speaking, there's some misunderstanding about what we do in geography. People tend to think that in the academy, we look at or sort of are fixated on describing places and what things are called and so forth. But in scholarship, it's quite a bit deeper than that. And ultimately, the discipline is fixated around questions of space and place. The unifying question is really, how do we explain what is going on in particular places, and how can we learn about place and spatial processes to help inform us on the issues that we're interested in? And you can kind of distill these down generally into these questions, into these three very basic questions: where things are, why they are where they are, and why we care about them. And as you can imagine, to understand a place, you have to draw in a great deal of research in other areas. And in that sense, geography is very much a holistic discipline. I consider myself to be a medical geographer or a health geographer. And basically, that subfield within the discipline assumes all of the methods, practices, and the focus of geography to ask questions about health. And so that's why we're particularly interested in, this is the subfield in geography that's particularly interested in the COVID-19 pandemic. And these are some of the general questions that geographers might ask, some of which I'll, particularly the second question, and the second and fourth questions listed here, I'll try to get to today in the lecture. So we might be interested in what explains the origin of a pandemic, particularly in certain places. Why do pandemics and emerging infectious disease, which I'll talk about in just a second, are more likely to emerge in some places than others? What are the specific environmental risk factors that contribute to that emergence? Related to that, we could also ask about the social and political factors that put a particular place on Earth at greater risk for emerging infectious disease or pandemics. And of course, this all culminates on what we can learn. What sort of environmental policies can we assume that could mitigate the risk for pandemics in the future? And you'll notice this little diagram on the right provides a very basic overview of the kinds of questions that geographers answer. We are interested in the links between populations, the natural habitat, and the behavior of those populations. And in that sense, I've always felt like the field sort of contributes a perspective that complements a lot of the more focused type questions that public health and the medical community in general likes to address. Geographers tend to be pretty fixated around the environment, the natural environment, and the questions around that. Okay, so first I'm going to talk very briefly about this term, emerging and resurging infectious disease. Traditionally, it was called emerging infectious disease, or EIDs. And that refers to a disease that the human societies don't have experience with. These are diseases that we view as novel. And throughout this lecture, I've tried to complement some of the other lectures in the series, so I won't talk too much about the biology of a pandemic, but it's very important to bear in mind that what makes these kinds of diseases a particularly great concern for human beings is that we don't have a history of exposure to them. So when a disease emerges, the populations don't have a century or more experience, and there's no autoimmunological responses. Of course, we don't have a great deal of understanding of the mechanisms of the disease, its spreads, its symptomology, or its treatment. And so this is a grave concern for human societies, particularly in the modern era. And I should also mention that the term resurging was added to EIDs to reflect the idea that a lot of these diseases that we viewed as emerging infectious diseases were in fact with us for a very long time, but that it didn't receive a lot of international attention. The diseases that tend to get the most attention are the ones that affect Western and wealthy societies. So some of these diseases that we call EIDs have been endemic in places like Africa, Latin America, Asia for a long time. It's just that it really hasn't hit the radar. So the word resurging was added to reflect that idea. So the National Institutes of Health put together this diagram to show the different kinds of emerging and re-emerging infectious disease that have occurred over the last several decades. And you can see from this map that it really isn't a problem that's specific to any particular region in the world. And we're going to talk about some of the risk factors that occur behind those in just a minute. This graphic is one that I'm putting together with some colleagues to demonstrate that there seems to be a pretty clear trend. You can see I've got listed several different indicators of how the environment has changed over the last couple of centuries. We've got tropical forest loss over sort of a litmus time before this, a few years before this graphic, the urban population in billions. Again, these graphs extend from 1800 to 2000, as well as one of the key indicators for global climate change, which is the parts per million of global carbon dioxide. And what this graphic is supposed to do is show you pretty clearly that emerging infectious disease and environmental degradation seem to be clearly linked. Throughout human history, we've had emerging infectious disease, starting with the bubonic plague and others before then, but really the changes to the environment seem to be a key causal factor that is accelerating this. Within the last 2 decades, from 2000 to 2020, you can see from the graphic, from the top part showing emerging infectious disease, that we've had at least, we recognize more events that occurred in the previous 2 centuries. So there's clearly something going on here, and these are linked. So let me talk a little bit about how emerging infectious disease occur and how those are related to a pandemic. Nearly all new infectious disease, with potentially some exceptions, originates in animal populations. And there are a huge number of pathogens circulating in animals. We don't have any sort of comprehensive idea of the extent in which these are occurring. Some animals are of greater concern to human beings than others. Obviously, animals that humans come into a lot of contact with. And then at some point, a spillover event occurs. And basically, a spillover event means that a previously zoonotic disease, or one that exists within animals, for some reason becomes a human disease. So maybe a human being comes in contact with an animal and gets infected. And so that would be a spillover event. Sometimes this can occur just through the natural evolution of the virus or pathogen. As you probably know, viruses are constantly evolving, and one of them might evolve to enable humans to be infected. We're even more concerned when it evolves further to be passed between human beings. And so when a disease spills over and becomes an emerging infectious disease, of course, it can then translate from an epidemic to a pandemic. Typically, the diseases that we are especially concerned with translating into a pandemic are the ones that evolve to be transmissible, or especially ones that are easily transmissible between human beings. And given the state of our sort of globalized society, once that happens, it becomes extremely difficult to control. And we can look at specific examples and think about how these different diseases, how these different emerging infectious diseases present different kinds of challenges to human beings, and ultimately what we can do about it. And something I'm hoping that in the COVID-19 pandemic, people are becoming a lot more aware of is that the COVID-19 pandemic and emerging infectious disease have been a concern for a very long time. And this is, I'll read you this quote from an excellent book on, I think it's called Plagues and Pandemics, from a veterinarian who wrote, "It is only a matter of time, many epidemiologists warn, until another epidemic on the scale of the Spanish influenza outbreak of 1918 to 1919, or the current HIV/AIDS pandemic sweeps across the globe." And in many ways, the emergence of a disease, of a pandemic like COVID-19, was inevitable. And so this, of course, raises the questions of where these occur, why they occur, and what we can do about it. And so as a means of exploring this question, I'm going to give you a brief tour of some of the recent emerging infectious diseases. Some of these you'll have a pretty clear memory of occurring. And as we go through these, I'd like you to bear in mind a couple, or let me list like 4 things to think about as we talk about these. First is the mode of transmission. In other words, how is the disease passed to human beings or between human beings? How does it spread among human beings, and what kinds of policies or practices can enable its transformation to a pandemic, or on the other hand, prevent it? What are the geographic constraints of the disease? If, for example, the disease is spread through a vector, so usually an insect like a mosquito or a tick that spreads it, that's going to put some pretty clear geographic constraints on it, whereas COVID-19 doesn't rely on any sort of vector, a species like this. And then finally, let's think, I'd like you to think about policy ideas. In other words, what can we do to mitigate the risk or prevent the EID from spreading or even translating into a global pandemic? So the first one I'll talk about is the Zika virus. This really hit the headlines about 5 years ago in 2015. I think a lot of you will remember that happening. It became a concern for the United States when we had, I believe, a couple of cases in Florida from people who were infected. As you may recall, this disease was particularly grave concern for pregnant women because infection led to complications with birth. This is a great example of a resurging infectious disease. It has been, it was first identified in Uganda in 1947. It has an animal reservoir, which means that there's an animal population that keep the disease alive, and it is vector-borne, spread between mosquitoes. So its transition from an EID to a pandemic had a lot to do with some of the facets of globalization. So when we have rapid human movement, when we've got airplanes traveling between infected areas and other areas that can harbor mosquitoes that can then infect people, or maybe somebody who is freshly infected travels and then can be infected by mosquito and then passed on to the population. And in this case, interestingly, they believe that an outbreak was starting in 2014 during the World Cup, and that bringing all these people from around the world together for the World Cup in kind of this dense population in Brazil was really a key factor sort of motivating its spread. So I'll briefly go to those 4 points I asked you all to think about. It's transmitted through the mosquito vector, spread through travel and trade, and in a sense, and I don't mean to ever downplay the seriousness of any of these, but what makes it a little bit easier to manage on a global scale is that it really is constrained by mosquito habitat. So we're unlikely to see the disease pop up in places where there isn't a sufficient mosquito population that can support the spread of the disease. And of course, for a disease like this, vector control is very important, as well as monitoring. And monitoring probably for any EID that we're concerned about is going to be a key policy, because if we can identify where it's a problem, then we can kind of focus down our efforts to prevent its further spread. The next disease I'll talk about, you could also call a resurging disease, is one that I think a lot of people are familiar with, but perhaps we don't view it as a pandemic, which the World Health Organization sort of unambiguously counts tuberculosis as a pandemic. It's spread by a bacterium. It doesn't have any known animal reservoir, and it's largely a disease of poverty that manifests in pretty poor living conditions. One of the major concerns with this disease is that disease-resistant or treatment-resistant pathogens, treatment-resistant bacteria are emerging because the effort to control the disease with antibiotics and the kind of treatment that goes along with tuberculosis is difficult, it's long, and that means that a lot of people around the world don't complete their treatment, and so we're starting to see resistant strains of tuberculosis sort of rise and become a point of concern. One thing that's very notable about this is about tuberculosis in particular is that it really highlights the other side of that equation, this social and political side of it. And I think because it's largely a disease of poverty that is constrained to poor regions of the world or poor populations within the wealthier regions of the world, it really faces a challenge of political motivation. There isn't much political will to fight the disease because it doesn't affect a lot of the people who make those decisions. So let's go back to the 4 points really quickly. Tuberculosis is transmitted through very close personal contact. It's spread through travel and trade, exposure to other infected individuals, not anything like as contagious or transmissible as COVID-19. And because there's no vector involved, it doesn't face any significant spatial constraints. The main constraint is the fact that it isn't highly contagious or as highly contagious as some others. And of course, policy responses include careful treatment as well as monitoring. And right now, one of the biggest efforts is to perform supervised treatment to make sure that the people who have the disease complete their treatment. And so they'll kind of set up appointments for people to come to the doctor and witness them take their medication and the antibiotics and such to fight the disease. Another fairly recent example, you might notice that this is often cited as almost an analogous case for COVID-19. We learned a lot from this disease, which is SARS. It's also a coronavirus. And it's believed that it originated from an animal reservoir in Guangdong. In 2003, it began to spread around the region, and there was pretty serious concern in the United States. And thankfully, the governments in East Asia and the other countries that were affected responded pretty quickly and efficiently. It spread similar to COVID through personal contact. Of course, we had to mind trade and travel very carefully, and there are no major spatial constraints. And what prevented SARS from becoming something similar to COVID-19 essentially was that it was nipped in the bud. I think a lot of people congratulated themselves at the time, but the lessons weren't learned well enough to prevent COVID-19. One of my hopes is that, especially after this kind of global event, that this historical global event, that emerging infectious diseases and our policies to catch these early will indeed, people will indeed start taking these a lot more seriously in the future. Another one, I wanted to include an example that's a little bit closer to home for those of us living in and from the United States, is Lyme disease. Also, this disease, I think, demonstrates this very close link between the environment and us human hosts. The disease is very complex. It's caused by a bacterium, and it's transmitted through the bite of infected ticks. This map on the screen shows you the primary areas of Lyme disease transmission as of a few years ago. And of course, this changes around a little bit as environments change. One of the primary antecedents for Lyme disease was ecosystem simplification. And basically what that means is that a biodiverse ecosystem with a variety of different mammalian and plant species were simplified. In the case of the United States and in the case of Lyme disease, this occurred largely through urban expansion into the suburbs and what they call the exurbs, sort of the regions just beyond the suburbs. So as they take down forests and build houses, a lot of the ecosystem isn't viable for a lot of the animals, and it focuses on particular species, enables some species to thrive because they lose their predators. And in the case of Lyme disease, the key change had to do with deer and mice, which sort of serve as spectacular reservoirs to keep the disease alive. So even though the disease existed previously in a less disturbed ecosystem, it never really became a significant human problem. So we can think about these 4 questions once again, these 4 points. It's transmitted by tick vectors. Ticks are necessary for its transmission. There's no human-to-human transmission, and so it's pretty carefully geographically constrained, although now we're starting to see cases that have migrated along with tick populations to parts of Europe, such as the UK. It's spread through exposure to environments with infected ticks, and of course, policies to avoid the spread of Lyme disease can include educational measures to avoid ticks, to teach people how to avoid ticks, as well as thinking about the fundamental problems that we're creating through this kind of ecosystem degradation. Because if we can strengthen the ecosystem once again, then we can address this problem. Okay. And I wanted to bring up the Nipah virus. One of the ideas I've got about COVID-19 is that while it has turned into this alarming and ultimately devastating global pandemic, in a lot of ways we can be fortunate that the mortality rate is as low as it is, somewhere between 1% and 3%. I've read some papers that call the mortality rate more along the lines of between 0.5% and 1%. The Nipah virus has sort of popped its head up starting in the late 1990s, and presently it can be passed to human beings through exposure to pigs and other agricultural animals. At the moment, the Nipah virus doesn't appear to sort of be biologically enabled to pass between human beings. So the cases that we see are from people who are farming, who have a lot of contact with these agricultural animals. And what's really scary is that it's got a like I said, a mortality rate in the range of 50 to 70%, which really puts it in a pretty different class from COVID. And the concern is that someday this disease will mutate in such a way that people can start passing it to one another. Hopefully, like I said before, with the onset of COVID, people are paying very careful attention to this. I think they are. The WHO is certainly monitoring it very carefully. So to go back to the 4 points that I brought up, the transmission is exposure to birds who have the disease. It's really spread only through agricultural exposure and constrained to regions with significant fowl infection. And of course, the policies that we could think about include minimizing contact with birds, careful monitoring, and really a plan to spring into action if the pathogen ever does acquire the ability for person-to-person transmission. Okay, so I think by now you will have heard a little bit about the origin story of COVID. As the scientific community tries to sort this out, there are some competing theories. One is that it jumps to it evolved to be able to affect human populations pretty recently, but there's also some evidence that it's been circulating in low levels in different parts of the world, but has gradually evolved over decades until it became a serious and persistent problem in late 2019. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is go through some of the drivers of EIDs. Let's think, I'll ask you to think about what are the fundamental and root causes. I'm going to talk a little bit in just a second about a study that has looked at EIDs over the past several decades and tried to identify different types of those and patterns in them. But I think the relevant processes that lead to the spillover of an EID are primarily environmental degradation, agricultural intensification, and urban expansion. In short, all of the changes that we've seen over the past couple of centuries that bring larger groups of people into more immediate contact with animal pathogens and also enable its very rapid transition from an EID to a pandemic. And so, in a sense, I'd like for us to induct from these examples to some principles that we can think about. I'll tell you a little bit about this study and I'll go through some of their findings. So Jones et al. Very carefully cataloged with a fairly loose definition of what an EID is, the EIDs historically over the past several decades. And from that, they were able to identify 4 different types of emerging infectious disease, as well as through this mapping exercise. We tend to like maps a lot in geography for obvious reasons, to sort of designate where the hotspots around the world are. So the first class are zoonotic pathogens, pathogens that exist within animal populations. They can cross into human populations when humans settle or hunt in wildlands. Examples include Lyme disease, which I just talked about, and HIV/AIDS, which they believe originated from the bushmeat trade in Africa, which is hunting exotic animals, particularly primates, butchering them and selling them and so forth. So they think it came into the human population through that activity. We can also think about EIDs that cross into human populations from agricultural systems. A little bit distinct from that first class because it has to do with specific agricultural practices. A lot of the EIDs that we've seen in recent years come through agricultural systems with birds in particular. Some of you may know about bovine spongiform encephalitis, otherwise known as mad cow disease, which started in the UK. That one came from the practice of rendering which was taking discarded animal parts and turning it into animal feed. And then, of course, we could also argue that COVID-19 was a result of agricultural systems as well. Another class that it certainly, at least not yet, is pertinent to COVID-19 is the overuse or the misuse of antibiotics. And so we're starting to see some diseases occur worldwide that really is the effect of poor controls on how antibiotics are used. This is often particularly relevant in agricultural systems as well, where they sometimes, some farmers, particularly in the United States, will administer a great deal of antibiotics. They call it prophylactic antibiotics to farm animals to make them healthier. They tend to grow bigger and everything else. But the problem with that is it really sets the stage when you use a lot of antibiotics and you don't make sure that every time you use it that it's thorough to kill off all of the pathogens. That ultimately leads to multi-drug resistant or drug resistant pathogens that become a problem. So tuberculosis, as I discussed, is an example of this, as well as staph infections, which some of you may have heard about as well. And then finally, such as for cases such as Zika, as I discussed, we have pathogens that spread through vector populations. And the whole strategy around these tend to change to a focus around controlling those vector populations and human exposures to it. So in summary, we can think about the specific events and the kinds of environmental activities that exacerbate risk of an animal pathogen spilling over or becoming a spillover event where they become a human health concern. And we can think about, in a general sense, population growth, decreased biodiversity, agricultural intensification, related to population growth, urban encroachment or the spread of urban environments into wild or natural environments, the hunting and bushmeat trade, as well as, like so many other health issues, poverty and inequality, where in poor regions, sanitary conditions and healthcare are substandard, which really opens a pathway for these to become human health problems. And then, of course, another sort of focal point of our concern in our policies is really the capacity for these emerging infectious diseases to transform from an epidemic into a pandemic. This is very difficult to control, but you can see that in the COVID-19 example, there have been cases of governments really thinking about this, such as restricting trade and travel, setting up testing procedures and quarantine procedures to kind of slow down the effects that our globalized economy has. But anytime a disease, like I said before, becomes easily transmissible between human beings, we really have an uphill battle because it's difficult to control. So it's very important that we think about monitoring. And one of the main points that I want to make about this, and I'm sincerely hoping that this perspective gets a lot more sort of press attention and attention from the academic community. And it's basically the One Health perspective, which is basically the idea that we cannot really separate human health from animal health or from environmental health. So in order to address the problem of emerging infectious diseases and this kind of growing risk that we're seeing of pandemics, that we've seen codified in the data for pandemics, is that we have to approach this by thinking not only about human health, but equally thinking about the natural environment as well as animal health. And I think that this diagram, which I believe originated from the World Health Organization, kind of explains the holistic approach that we need to take from this. So not only do we need to get doctors involved, and of course, medical geographers and other social scientists involved who study human health. But we need to start thinking about agricultural systems, get veterinarians involved with this research, as well as very seriously address environmental health. The idea is that we're not going to solve this problem unless we address all three facets of this One Health perspective simultaneously. Okay, and I want to kind of try to end on a hopeful note once again. My feeling is that the world probably needed a serious pandemic to be brought into attention, to put this in focus. I hope that we can all learn some lessons about sort of how we've coped with the COVID-19 pandemic. That we learn lessons and give sort of political attention and funding to preventing it from occurring in the first place, but also be ready to respond in the case that something like the Nipah virus in Southwest and Southeast Asia starts to transform into sort of a more of an international concern. And so I'll leave you with some thought questions. I think that if you think about these root causes, we can start to think about environmental policies at a variety of different scales. This is the idea of scales is a term that geographers love to use. We can think about international community policies, sort of regulating, monitoring, setting up global collaboration to keep track of diseases that we're concerned about, putting in safety protocols, perhaps, especially when we begin to become concerned about a disease like this, to stop the spread. We can think about what regional and national governments can do in regulating their own environments, sort of preventing ecosystem simplification and other sort of ecological causes, as well as other planning things. And then we can think about actions that we as individuals can take, even through the kinds of food we eat, or the purchase we make, or the way that we put ourselves in risk with these potentially pandemic diseases. And so that concludes my presentation. Hopefully I explained sort of how geographers are thinking about this and some of the roles that the natural environment plays when we start to address the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great. That was really interesting. And I'm going to start us off with questions, kind of raised by some of your thought questions. What happens in the kind of situation that we have now when there is no kind of unified global response?
Well, I think that again, I've been accused of being too much of an optimist at times, but as we kind of transition into this globalized world, I think we see a large number of problems that are truly global in nature, such as climate change. It's really, really difficult and a key challenge in sort of countering the effects, or sort of implementing policies to combat climate change, because so much governance occurs at the national scale. And I'm hoping, and this is really the mission of the World Health Organization when it was originally established, and presently as well, that people can recognize that because it is a global system now when it comes to pandemics, that we have to develop a strong sort of form of international governance. One of the problems of the United Nations and World Health Organizations and other IGOs, or international government organizations, is the real lack of ability to enforce much. You may have heard that the WHO is pretty much advisory, and that's going to completely stymie our effects unless we we are not going to be able to deal with COVID-19 until we come up with a consistent global response, whether we like that or not. And so I'm hoping that in these key areas, I'm hoping that people will begin to recognize that pandemic really requires global action rather than relying on our sort of traditional national structure.
Yeah.
It all has to do with the scale of the problem.
Right. No, I see it. So here's a question from our participants. Have plants ever been vectors or reservoirs for disease, or is it mainly from animals?
Mainly from animals, clearly. I mean, generally speaking, in a general sense, the closer the animal is to human beings in an evolutionary sense, uh, perhaps because of the kind of blood proteins and other biological mechanisms that I can't really speak to, the greater the risk for a spillover. So we have almost no risk from fish, for example, because they're distant from human beings. We have to be very, very, very careful when we work with primates because they're rife with viruses that can successfully cross that species barrier. And interestingly, a lot of you may have noticed that bats come up a lot when we talk about these diseases. And if you trace the evolutionary history of bats, they're really not far behind primates. They kind of split from primates late in the game. So they're actually one of our closer relatives than some other animals.
It's interesting. So you explained kind of specific environmental changes for Lyme disease. What were some of the specific things that happened with the other diseases you described?
Well, generally speaking, I would say for a lot of these, ecosystem simplification is a huge problem because over the course of thousands of years, when a pathogen occurs in a human population, nature has a way of kind of working itself out so that, ultimately you think of disease pathogens as its own animal with its own ecosystem. So with time, it can't do too much damage to its own ecosystem, humans and animals, because it kills itself off. And then when the environment experiences rapid degradation, these systems are thrown out of balance. I use Lyme disease because it's a very clear link. But if you look carefully enough in some of these other cases, we can see links too. So let's take Zika, for example. When the environment changes, that disrupts the kind of natural controls of mosquitoes, for example. They become much more prolific, and this is exacerbated by crowded human populations that lets it get a foothold in human beings, and then those humans, of course, travel and deposit the pathogen in other places. So hopefully the Zika part really answers that question, but also in a more general sense, kind of how those two things are related.
So, fun fact, I was married in Old Lyme, Connecticut,
Oh yeah,
which is where disease originated.
got its name, I'm sure. Yeah.
Yes. So, do you think that we are better at identifying and distinguishing between diseases now than we were 50 years ago? I'm curious if we had a lot of diseases years ago that have simply resurged now that the environmental factors have changed, but perhaps we were unaware.
Oh yes, I would say. As you kind of dip into this, into the literature on this, you begin to realize. And this has come up with COVID-19, that there are many pathogens that we have no clue about. We have a very poor understanding, as it is, of what circulates among animal populations. We think, to the best of our knowledge, and I believe this, EIDs have popped up in particular, over the last couple of centuries, and especially over the last couple of decades. But the honest truth is, it very well could have gone undetected. They know there are examples of pathogens that people acquire from animals that just happen to be asymptomatic. So it doesn't get attention. Nobody really notices it. There have got to be, there are definitely examples historically of emerging infectious diseases that just never really hit the radar of the medical community or society more generally. I mean, like I said, we've even seen some of the challenges of this with COVID-19. I remember learning recently that they have evidence from examining, doing sort of post-mortem examinations in places outside of China where they suspect that they're finding examples of deceased people with COVID that occurred before the pandemic began, which really threw the whole sort of hypothesis of its origin in the Chinese markets into question.
Oh, that's interesting. So, how does tuberculosis really fit in this kind of grouping of environmentally caused diseases?
Um, I would tuberculosis is a very, very old one that we've had. It's probably one of the oldest diseases that we deal with, and I think the connection between the environment and tuberculosis is probably a lot more difficult to see. It might, the environments that are particularly critical around tuberculosis are the human constructed ones,
Right.
especially dense living conditions and impoverished living conditions. So um, while I would have some difficulty in speaking to the natural environmental sort of underlying causes of tuberculosis, it's certainly the environments that we as humans create. And in geography, we do make this distinction between natural and human environments, but you begin to realize pretty quickly that it's a very blurry distinction between the two.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think we don't have any more questions, but I think that was a great lecture. I really understand a lot. I'm terrified of the Nipah virus now.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, and the good news is, and what really protects us, honestly, I think, is I don't think I can emphasize enough. What's going to save us is people being terrified of it and caring about it.
right.
If people took, I mean, in China, in the United States, and everywhere, if they understood last February, I think, where we would be in June, it would be a very different story. And I know people, the WHO is on the job with Nipah, and I think the rest of the world, after we've been traumatized by this, uh, is going to approach future pandemics in a much more serious way.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. We have our lecture coming up on Wednesday by Steve Kester from the Department of Anthropology and looking at COVID through the lens of medical anthropology. That's what's coming up next. So, which I think will kind of flow really nicely from what you've talked about today, Professor Anthamatten. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. This was I've really enjoyed this lecture series. It's been spectacular.
Thank you. All right.
Take care.
Take care. Bye bye, everyone.
Bye.